So yeah, this is a conversation that I've been excited to have for a long time. I was reminding myself this week that Monica was actually part of the motivation for launching Building Belonging when she hosted a salon at her home, maybe in 2018, many years ago, with another member of Building Belonging. So it's kind of fun to see this come full circle. Building Belonging, briefly, community of practice for folks who are trying to build belonging in the world. We do that in lots of different ways. More to say about that community. There's a few folks here on it. So if you want to raise your hands or wave or drop something in the chat so other folks can find you when you're in breakouts, please do so. And yeah, one premise of this community and of this conversation is that we actually have no choice but to build a world where everyone belongs. And that in order to do that, we need to have everyone's voice present. And so conversations across difference are essential. There's no way forward without them. And across diversity, and because we are human, that will generate conflict. And so Monica's book is essential. The conversation that she's trying to instigate feels like the kind of conversations we're trying to have inside the community. So we're happy to have a chance to bring it to y'all here. I am hoping to just offer a few questions to get things started. Monica likes to have more of a less formal fireside chat thing. I'm sure she's been doing lots of these, lots of podcasts. So I'll offer maybe 3 questions just to get things going and invite folks to be thinking about what lands for you, what questions you have. Hopefully you've had a chance to look at some of her work. Her book is amazing. So we'll share more about that. But wanted to just kick off here. We'll do maybe 15 minutes or so of this, and then we'll have a chance for some small breakouts for you all to choose and think about what you want to bring back to the plenary. And then we'll come back to plenary and have a chance for Q&A with Monica. Monica needs to drop at the hour. And then for those of us who want to stick around for a little bit, we'll have a bit more spaciousness on the other side to continue the conversation and think about practice. Monica's book does a good job at the end of each chapter of inviting us into what we can do. So we'll want to create a space for us to do that. So with that, Monica, welcome. Thanks for being here. Thanks for your book. And I'd love for you to start just by telling us a little bit about you and what would you like us to know about you and why did you write this book?
So I am a journalist. I am a bridge builder. I've embraced that identity. I work at Braver Angels, which is a nonprofit that dedicates itself to depolarizing America. Real easy stuff. And I wrote this book. There's a couple threads that led to it. The personal one, which is what comes up first for me, is that I am a liberal who voted for Biden, and my parents are conservatives who voted for Trump. We are Mexican immigrants. We became citizens in the year 2000. And pretty immediately, the divide in the way that we tended to settle on political ideas was pretty clear. And it caused all kinds of crazy conversations. Even when I was in high school, we're a very unfiltered family. It's one sort of, I guess, Latino stereotype I do embrace as it applies to our family. Very unfiltered. Like you never don't know where you stand with my mother. You never really don't know, like within the family, where you stand with me. And so we put it all on the table and we would have loud, sometimes vicious conversations. And then the 2015 presidential campaign happened. And I could not believe that my parents would support someone that I found so abominable. And so the conversations, the volume, the heat turned up even higher and got so intense. And yet I was able to get to the point where I could say that I really understood the reasons for their voting the way they did. And not only that, but that if I were my parents, I would have voted that way too. It made that level of sense to me. And they could say the same with me around Biden and Clinton. So it was the contrast between that experience and the national polarization, the toxicity of it. Now, the other thread is journalism. I've been a journalist my whole career. I find the reason that I'm a journalist is because I think it is so difficult and yet so essential for our society to thrive that we work to understand each other. And that sounds so obvious, and easy, but it's not. So much gets ahead of that in our minds when we engage each other across difference. So much feels like it needs to come first. And yet understanding is seeing. And if people aren't seen, if people aren't heard, they can't see, they can't hear you back. And so all of that just kind of came to a head for me, where I thought, I think I need to put down some of these stories, and I need to put down some of these observations, because as a journalist, my job is to portray people as accurately as I can, whatever moves them, whatever their story is. And I take very seriously the need to be accurate. And it's just so difficult in a world like this to not get caught up in assumptions and labels, and not try to see the person, actually see the person with everything that gets ahead of them. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. Yeah, lots of juicy threads to follow, and thanks for sharing some of your family story. It's yeah, I appreciate the vulnerability and your parents' willingness to be part of your story on a national stage. So I love the book, and I agree with about 95% of it. And congratulations also. I think there's news out recently. There's a reprint happening with some New York Times quotes in it. So it's exciting to see it getting some uptake. So I'm going to give everyone here a false impression of my feelings about the book by diving straight into places where I found myself resisting, because we want to have a difficult conversation, and I know Monica's up to it. But I just want to share at the front end that it is amazing, and it's a much needed contribution. So please don't take the fact that I'm going to poke at it to reflect my broader perspective on it. So the first place that I found myself kind of a little queasy or squeamish around it is this. So I'm also a child who comes from a vigorous dinner table conversation family. And there's a line that Kazu Haga said that's been sticking with me. And Kazu Haga is a conflict transformation practitioner. And he said, quote, "Sometimes taking space is actually the best way to stay in relationship." And what I took that to mean is that actually sometimes the best way to stay connected is to disconnect. And that's hard for me as someone who's like, I need a lot of intimacy, a lot of connection. I find myself, it's hard to take space. And so I'm curious, in a book that's about how do we bridge, how do we connect, I'm curious how you think about when do you not, like when do you need to disconnect and try to stay in a relationship?
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful insight. That sometimes, what was the quote again? You need to, take the space is the best way to be in relationship, right? Yeah,
I'll drop in the chat here.
Yeah, thanks. I think that is spot on in so many contexts. Yeah, sometimes taking space is actually the best way to stay in relationship. When we approach other people, we almost never actually approach them. What we approach is our projection of them. We're never honest about that. But each of us is a deep mystery, so complicated that we barely understand ourselves, let alone other people. So that's just the truth of it. When we approach other people, we approach our projections of them. We fill in the gaps and the blanks, and we make a lot of assumptions because otherwise it's hard to function. So what that means is that to get to the point where we can actually be ready or able to see other people as they actually are, and where they're ready and able to see us for who we actually are, can be extremely difficult, because a lot of the projections we have of other people and of ourselves serve good ends. Now, those projections, they're not always false. So an example I'm thinking of now is sometimes within our identities or within the groups that we inhabit, we feel unseen as a whole category, right? We've seen this with race, we've seen this with class, we've seen this with gender. And as that whole category, it sort of feels like, how can we even relate to other people in our society when we feel so unseen? And you can do this on the micro or the macro level. A teenager in her family feeling misunderstood by her parents, etc., right? A husband feeling unseen by the wife. And so those projections that we have of each other, if we're constantly colliding, those projections keep getting activated, and those assumptions and labels keep coming to the fore. They keep coming to the fore. They keep coming to the fore. They get stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. And what you end up doing is actually getting further and further and further apart. Now, this is a humbling observation for me, because when I have conflicts with my husband, his thing is to think silently when we're fighting. My thing is to not shut up. Like, my assumption is that if I am quiet, we're not doing the work. And I've had to learn very humbly that actually the most important dialogue that needs to happen is not with him, but with myself. So because of that, that's the place that right now is coming up for me of like the truth that I see in this quote. Sometimes taking space is actually the best way to stay in relationship, because all we can control is ourselves. And we're going to need a lot of time sometimes to work through whatever our projections are telling us about what an interaction with this other person would mean, what it would say about us, what emotions or things come up that make us feel tight or like we can't do it. You know, that may not work. So what I say in the book, and it came out very organically over time. I didn't begin saying this, and then it started to pop up everywhere. And my editor was like, "This is an important idea. You should put it more prominently." I'm like, okay, and I moved it around. Is that the most important thing to do with a bridge is not to cross it, but to keep it. So, Brian, when you're talking about disconnection, here's where I think disconnection is not productive. It's where we say, never again. I want nothing to do with that person ever again. When we steel our hearts for the permanence of that exclusion, that's what I think of as burning the bridge. When you burn the bridge entirely, you give absolutely no chance for anything to transform within you or within them to make some kind of relationship possible. So that's why I come down to that principle. Disconnecting, taking space, is not burning a bridge. So long as you leave open the possibility that, oh yeah, that's a person just like me, right? Or that's an idea that somebody holds that I really don't like, but maybe there's a way to engage with it someday. That's where I think we need to try to be, even if it's a tiny little thread, just a thread, but don't talk to him for years, as long as you don't burn the bridge.
Smart editor. I like that. All right, I'll throw one more out here, which is a very live inquiry for me. I'm hoping Monica's going to solve it one for all. Pressure, and then we'll drop into breakouts here in a second. And I want to try to frame this question carefully, because it's hard for me to even articulate it. So Monica offers these care principles in her book, and so I'm going to try to make it curious, answerable, raw, and exploring, and Monica will tell me when I fail. So the question is this: in your chapter on sorting, you talk about the number of counties in the U.S. that went in a landslide for one candidate or another, and in the 2020 election, it's 55%. So more than half the country is landslide. And I guess one question I have, or seems implicit in your thing, is like, is that a bad thing? And I think it's easier to kind of look back at Civil War, which you mentioned, and I want to sort of play with this concept of polarization here. So in the chapter on othering, you talk about 3 different types of polarization: affective, ideological, and false. Affective, as I understand it, and please correct me, is mistrust or dislike of the other, or that other may be. Mm-hmm. False is when you perceive more polarization than actually is there. And ideological is sort of what it implies, like a difference in opinion or perspective. And I guess what I want to do is zoom in on ideological polarization, and maybe agree wholeheartedly that we need to transcend or bridge or reconnect or not engage in affective and false polarization. But I think where I get hung up is if you think about the Civil War, the fact of polarization wasn't bad, right? It was actually quite good, right? Hopefully not everyone agrees that slavery should happen. And so the answer is not, the metaphor of a bridge is uncomfortable for me, because a bridge implies like we meet together or we go back and forth. And actually in that case, the bridge is like, no, one group actually needed to come join the side of justice. And so The question I might want to put out there is, love to hear your thoughts on ideological polarization and whether it can be a good thing. Mm-hmm. And then the place I want to get to, and if this is a leading question, push back and reject it, mm-hmm. is what happens after understanding? I understand the motivations, intentions, curiosities, longings of Southern white, plantation owners, and respectfully needs to change. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah. No, it's great. So the first piece was, right, address ideological polarization. Polarization is not the problem. Blindness is. So I think that's really important. Disagreement is democracy. If we stop disagreeing, we're in trouble because obviously we're not being honest with each other. A good, healthy democracy, we have all kinds of different personalities. Studies have shown that people are not made necessarily into liberals or conservatives. They're almost kind of born that way. There's an inclination to have sort of your value stack kind of put you in a different place. I choose to kind of look at that as an almost like immune system for our whole society. That there's a yin and yang, that there's a cool balance in the way that different people grow with hearts that point them in some different directions. And those directions sometimes lead large groups of people into really, really, really terrible directions. But a lot of times don't. And what they really do is just keep us in a good mix. So polarization is not the problem. Blindness is. Affective polarization is, as you said, it's the polarization that's born of animosity, the feelings toward the other people. There's been some really interesting research that traces ideological polarization, the degree to which people actually disagree, versus affective polarization, the hostility toward the other side. The gap is tremendous. And that gap is our blindness. That gap is everything that stands in our way when we might want to come together and find some creative solutions for now on these number of intractable problems, from abortion to gun control to everything else, right? So yeah, polarization is not the problem. It's the blindness that's the problem. So yeah, that's the thing I want to kind of settle on. Brian, can you re-articulate your point about your second point?
Yeah, so in a case, and I think the Civil War is maybe more clear-cut than problems today, but perhaps not in the face of rising white nationalism. What happens next? So we understand, we get to agreement. Jordan Peterson and I have a sit down. I respect him as a person. And we have a fundamentally different view of what needs to happen. And I think we can say, at least in retrospect, in the Civil War, there is actually only one just answer, right? So there is one group that needs to change. So what happens after understanding? I know this is like a little beyond the scope of your book because you're arguing for understanding, which feels essential. So if it's an unfair place to go, feel free to push back. But I guess I'm curious, so we've got through curiosity, we've got to understanding, one party needs to change or to allow the world to change. Mm-hmm. What then?
I think it is extraordinarily rare. Let's go down an unknown path here, right? Let's try this. I think it is extraordinarily rare for it to be true that the entire comprehensive task of understanding only needs to happen on one side. Meaning, like, even to take your case of the Civil War, right? The Civil War. Clearly, the right path is no slavery. There's no doubt, right? Like, especially now. There's no doubt about that. But that was not actually necessarily the only thing wrapped up in that. Part of what was wrapped up in that was Southerners' anxiety about their economic futures if they didn't have a system called slavery, right? So there's a degree to which you can imagine, and again, I'm going to risky places because let's try it. There's a degree to which you can imagine, the person who is there to have the conversation about the wrongness of slavery, meeting resistance, not necessarily 100% because the person on the other side of that conversation loves slavery, but maybe because the person on that other side of the conversation loves, and there's a white person, obviously with a lot of power, loves the security of it for his way of life. Well, and so suddenly everything gets complicated.
I want to kind of, it's a tough counterfactual because I think, we're so deep in conflict that it's hard to get to this place, but I want to assume mutual understanding, right? Maybe where you are with your parents.
Gotcha.
So we've got there.
So on all the fronts, we've laid it all out.
Yeah. And the person says, hey, I don't want to change my economic livelihood.
Yeah.
And what then? So we've got to understand him. Like, let's say Brave Angel is successful. We're having the kind of conversations we should be having. Everyone's read your book. We're good. We still live in a system that's characterized by white supremacy.
Right.
So we need to get rid of that system.
Mm-hmm.
Some people will lose in the short term if we do that. So from a place of mutual understanding, how do we take that next step when it involves people giving up power?
Right.
Easy question, I know.
Well, yeah, that's interesting because not everyone agrees that that's what it takes. And we should acknowledge that. Not everyone agrees with that assertion. But let's assume we get to a place of mutual understanding. Then none of us have lived this reality, so we can't really say for sure that we would get here. But what I believe happens is that everyone has gotten more flexible, and that persuasion is now easier. And that the reason my book is called I Never Thought of It That Way is because I talk about the importance of chasing moments in conversation where people think or say, I never thought of it that way. They won't get there to that level of humility unless they feel seen and heard, right? But at that point, that is when you see people like go back and go, okay, you make a good point there. Shoot, yeah, all right. So I think once you get to understanding, what you also have to get to is respect. And once you get to respect, a lot more becomes possible than we are used to imagining, right? So can I make any promises on that? Absolutely not. Will that mean that we can resolve really intractable issues really quickly and easily? Absolutely not, right? Like abortion puts some really good values into extreme tension with each other. And there's no such thing as a solution that's going to make everyone happy on that. And it will always be probably a tension. But who knows? Culture may move in a certain direction. So there's that sense is like, I do believe in like the best that we can do as a society is to get to a really honest, candid, open, respectful search for truth. And it has to be collective. And as long as we believe that we are better than them, they are better than us, that I'm here just to change them, because until they change, we're not, on this one thing, and I'm not here to learn from them, but they're here to learn from me, that's going to be a problem. So that's why I put so much stock on understanding, Brian, basically, is because I think that once understanding is actually really achieved, the entire landscape changes.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to invite the rest of the group into some conversation with us. These are hard topics, and I appreciate you wading in. And I agree. It is difficult to imagine so few of us have experienced genuine understanding across serious difference or conflict. It's hard to imagine how transformative that actually is. So I appreciate that. I want to invite folks to just drop into breakouts here. The invitation is to, what's landing, what isn't, what questions are live for you, what do you kind of want to bring back to the plenary or discuss happily in your small group. So we'll just do a few minutes for y'all to kind of toss about some ideas with each other, and then we'll come back here and have some time for kind of general discussion before we do a little soft close. Let me create the breakouts, and I'll try to drop that in the chat. And we'll do maybe 6 minutes or so. Sorry, so short, but I want to have some time for the group to be together. Welcome back. Hopefully some of you solved polarization in your little breakouts, and we'll share the answers with the rest of us. So we got about 10 minutes or so before Monica needs to drop. So I wanted to see if we can give a chance for y'all to chat with her and with each other. But we'll have a bit more time for folks who choose to stay. I hope some of you will, with a little more spaciousness on the other end. So the floor is open. What's alive for you? What are you sitting with? Any thoughts you have for Monica? Oh, I see this is a polite group. We're going to raise hands. You obviously were not at Monica or my dinner table growing up. Catherine, please go for it.
So I think this is great, and I think it's important to understand each other. But what happens in a situation where one or more people in the group are using what I'm going to politely call alternative facts, where we do not have the facts in common? That is one of the really big issues that I see.
Yes. Oh, I love that. I've done a lot of thinking about that in particular because I'm a journalist, right? And journalism's function is to help society see the truth. So I've thought about this, and what the key question to me comes down to this: we want people to affirm a shared reality to earn our trust. But what if it takes trust to build a true shared reality? The next place that I go to is journalism, fact finding. It's focused on truth. It's a truth building institution. But I've asked myself, what is our trust building institution? Do we have one? And the best answer I've been able to come up with for now is that we don't, because we have been taking for granted that the trust building institution is our own relationships across difference, which have, as the research shows us, been severed in so many systematic ways that we're not building trust. So that's a long way of saying that what I would respond to what you've offered is that a lot of times I think people see a disagreement in what facts are more true as sort of, we can't go beyond this anymore. There's nothing more to do here. There's no more work to do. This is just a huge impasse and it's offensive. And I think that truth building and trust building are actually two different things. And so what I do when I have conversations with people who don't believe the results of the election, think that there was massive voter fraud or whatever, like talk about all the conspiracy theories, is I don't stay on the truth building conversation. I go to the trust building one. And I ask them instead questions like, what most concerns you about this? And I get to their experience and their lives and their path. And we're not talking about the facts. Now, does that mean that will they ever like come to see the truth as I know it? I'm actually unconcerned with that in the moment of that conversation. If I am too concerned with that in that moment in the conversation, I am putting myself above them and I'm making respect and understanding and trust impossible.
Maybe we can invite 2 or 3 comments and see if Monica can do some weaving here. Just being mindful of time. Joanne, I don't know if you intended to come off mute. If you'd like to share, please do. Otherwise, floor.
Oh.
So, no, you're good. Okay.
I have a thing. Aloysius here. It's more just a comment. I don't know where it's going. It's just floating in my head, but I'm thinking about social survival and how that's always on. And until we've healed like from our traumas or become aware of them, we're kind of operating from that stance. So anytime 2 people enter a conversation or a conflict or an argument, I guess if they're not grounded in their identity is kind of what I'm understanding, you know, like if they're maybe identifying with things like white and trying to be a good white person or X, Y, and Z, like they're using an identity that was created to shape identity politics. And like they're operating from that instead of their truth. And I just feel like something that we have to acknowledge if we want to like do the work and be in relationship with people, knowing how polarized it is and seeing how wild it is, I feel like we have to start being like, hey, can you put your sword down? Like, I feel like we need to, like, when we step down to talk to each other and be like, okay, we're not actually trying to fight. Like, and I think we've been conditioned to literally fight. Our tongues were created to slice. Like,
That's right.
You know, English is, it was a tool. It was a social tool and initially a weapon. And we've learned how to use it and we're trying to use it gracefully. But like, yeah, I think as we get older, the more we don't acknowledge that or put that out front, we kind of like just kind of lead with it on a subconscious level. And we're like constantly protecting ourselves and our relationships with other people. And it's like, how do you be truly vulnerable? And like, I don't know, there's something about how people get in arguments and it tears them apart. What if people being like, I don't want this to tear us apart? Can we disagree? Can we get it all off our chests and see each other in our fullness and like witness each other? Yeah. And then can we walk away from this still like friends, you know, like that's kind of the energy I want to see, like conversations. Otherwise we just start fighting with each other. We think we're being attacked or we have to defend ourselves or something. And yeah, I don't know. That was just ramble rants. It's not
No,
going.
I think you're spot on. Like I'm singing to that. That's spot on. I have a chapter in my book called Attachments, which was difficult to write, but it's about the dialogue we have with ourselves about those things that feel like we have to stay attached to them, whether they are identities or certain causes that make us feel that we're good or bad, depending on how well we perform, or like act like. And sometimes to be in really honest, candid, open, powerful conversation with someone who disagrees with us, it really does mean, can we be, even for a few moments, not attached to those attachments, but letting them kind of like letting a little air appear between them, just so we can allow ourselves to consider how someone else would see something. It's one of the most difficult things to do, but it's really cool.
I wonder, Monica, if you could share that the anecdote you offered about the gentleman who said, "I'm not comfortable with this conversation," felt like such a powerful little like drop to kind of create space.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, long story short, I was observing this exercise that brought some pretty like highfalutin folks together to learn a very challenging form of leadership. And they were doing this simulation, blah, blah, blah. And like this one person in the group that I observed was basically like almost leading by being very cynical and constantly getting a laugh, kind of making fun of the exercise, and everyone kind of kept looking toward him, and it was leading the group to make not great decisions, not really take it seriously. And so they were figuring out one decision, and then this one person who hadn't said a word the whole time just suddenly goes, "I'm not comfortable with this conversation." And just like that, everyone looked to him, and I was like, what's he gonna say? And then he just presented how he saw things and where he thought the decision ought to go. And after that moment, funny guy didn't have any power. It was really cool. And they made better decisions.
I'm conscious of time and want to give folks who need to drop a chance to do so, and Monica as well. So a preview, we'll continue this conversation in plenary for a little bit. And then what I'm hoping to do is invite folks into practice. So think about, is there, our check-in prompt was around a conversation you wish you could have. Is that something you want to act on? Is there an intention you want to carry out of this? But before we do a little soft close here, just return back to Monica. If there's anything else that remains, I mean, obviously lots, but anything you'd like to close with, anything that you'd like us to sit with as we.
I guess I'll just say, often I run into there's a lot of challenges to this kind of work that I embrace and welcome, because there's no final answer, and everyone should always be learning, right? And one of those, I think, is about people kind of imagine or consider the hardest possible scenario and think, you're asking me to do that. I mean, John Powell, Brian, whom you know, and maybe folks in this group, talks about, are you asking me to bridge with the devil, right? And that's so inspiring to me, because it shows that when we are afraid, we think of the worst possible thing, and just have to argue against that in order to not feel any obligation or responsibility to engage in this work at all. But I think that the truth is that getting more curious can happen in extremely small incremental steps from wherever people happen to be. And it can be as simple as, you don't even have to engage in conversation with another human being. You could also just, next time you encounter a headline of an article that represents a point of view that you do not understand and you really rebel against, but you know that it's popularly held, you're going to open that article and you're going to read it, and you're going to ask yourself the curious question, what deep down honest concerns are being expressed here that I may not share, but I can maybe identify. And just that will make you more curious. So yeah, there's so many small steps, and each one counts. Each one is everything. So I'll leave you all with that.
It's a great transition to practice. Invite folks to come off mute and say thank you to Monica. If you need to drop, please do, and share, invite you to check out in the chat with a feeling that you're sitting with. So we'll do that. And then for folks who want to stay, we'll continue the conversation. Monica.
Okay.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm just going to drop there's a couple places to find me out there if you want. Okay, great to meet you all. I'll talk to you later.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Monty.
See ya.
For any brave souls who wish to stay, my intention for this space, and this is for me as well, I found Monica's book lot of aggressive head nodding and some real challenges for me because, yeah, I think it raises questions for me around power and around how we handle some of these stuff. And Alois just brought us straight into trauma healing, which is like, yep, that's part of it. So open floor here. I thought we could do maybe 10 minutes together, see how folks are feeling, and then have space for breakouts before we close. But anything else, folks feel called to bring? It's a slightly smaller group, so I don't feel like I need to facilitate. Feel free to chat as you feel called. But yeah, open prompt, maybe anything that's still sitting with you, reactions, questions, anything at all, really. And if folks would feel more comfortable, we can also just stop the recording and have a little private conversation out here, free from YouTube viewers.
In the small group with Aloysius, she brought up the wonderful point, which was reflected in the main group as well. The argument is a very colonial way of, like winning in conversation. And I do see a lot of people, especially in my world, men who are very, like they jump into a particular style of arguing, like at the drop of anything. So like when I'm in that situation, like working, etc., I wonder if people have suggestions for like shifting that conversation out of this game that they are so primed to do.
Welcome to Stephen and Tom. We just closed the first session now, having an open kind of conversation about some of the reflections. So feel free to listen in and chime in as you feel called. Ying was just sharing an inquiry around, yeah, how do we pivot from this kind of combative, argumentative, oppositional, colonial, white stance into something a bit more juicy and nurturing?
So one thing that I learned in circle training and circle work was to try to bring things back to the intention. So if we have a collective intention, so it's like, and a shorthand quote from Brene Brown is, do I want to be right or make the relationship right? And that can be a choice because sometimes it's a relationship thing, so you're going to give that up. So focusing on intention, I think is the center part for me.
Yeah, I have one thing to add. Circling work, really admire that. Would love to learn more, Catherine. So I learned in my authentic relating training in Guatemala about naming interpersonal dynamics. So actually making a dynamic explicit and naming it and putting it out there. So one thing that I'll do when I notice myself getting into an argument, when my intention is not to argue or be right or be egotistical or be intellectually arrogant, is I'll be like, hey, I'm noticing that I feel like we're arguing right now, and this is not my intention. Do you notice that as well? Naming that dynamic and putting it out there, I think, is a useful tool for my communication.
Hearing that makes me think about like social justice stuff, like naming identities and stuff like that. I've seen a lot of harm in communities where people use identity politics to understand the conflicts that they are inside. Identity politics are not meant for interpersonal relationships. So when people start looking at, say, I see this all the time, and a prime example is immediately whenever there's like two people in conflict and one is male and one is female, people usually want to know, is it a white man? And it's like, way to dehumanize one person out of this story. Like, we're not even into the conflict and you're already picking this person's identity apart. It's the subconscious stuff we do in the background that can cause us to like end up fighting or think we're in a battle, right? We think we're in a battle, like just because it could be like quote unquote white guy sitting across from us. So we think it's some person in a position of power who's dominating us just because they can, when that might not be the scenario. So I think I liked hearing the naming the things. I like naming the things and acknowledging the identity politics that are present so that we can depower them, so that they don't have power, so that we don't let them control the narrative and keep it on the human level. Yeah, that was just coming up when I was listening to that last share. It was really good. Thank you.
I love that. Thanks for the addition.
Mm-hmm.
To go along with what you just said, there's a really good conversation with Baratunde Thurston with Eric Liu, where they talk about power a lot. It's in Baratunde's How to Citizen podcast. And the whole issue about talking about power is just interesting.
One more. Go
I
ahead.
was just, I didn't catch the name of the podcast or the thing or whatever.
We'll see if we can find a link to it. One thought and one invitation is for folks who haven't had a chance to speak. If you feel so called, please do. No obligation if you're enjoying listening. And the prompt that I had as a kind of a follow-up question for Monica that we didn't get to is around, it's not a Monica question, it's for all of us, which is, I'm curious in her, the title of her book is, I Never Thought of It That Way. And when I read the first anecdote where she introduced that concept, I felt like a squeamishness in my body, like it feels hard to admit that. Like, and my question, the inquiry I'm curious about is like, why is it so hard for us to admit we didn't know something or to change our minds? Or like, I can't tell if it's a naive question or if it's worth actually unpacking. Like, why is it difficult for us to be like, yeah, I didn't know that. And of course I couldn't have, or, I had a new perspective on something. Yeah, I guess I'm just curious about like the cultural context, and for folks who are joining us from other cultures or other places in the world, like, why is it so hard to apologize or just admit that we didn't know something? Feels like an assumption that's built into the book that we don't quite take seriously. And I'm just curious about that. So folks can either respond to that or go wherever you want to go.
I do have a hot take on this one. So I'm from the United States. I grew up in the United States. And I believe that there's this thing that happens in parenting, between parenting and childing, where you tell your kids that it's safe to make mistakes, but every time they fuck up, you punish them. We're always being punished for making mistakes. So we have this like embodied sense of that's not safe. And I feel like that's the tug, the undercurrent. It's why we lie. We don't feel safe. And it's why, yeah, that's what comes up for me, is that it wasn't safe to make mistakes. So when we are wrong, we feel bad or we think we're doing wrong. And it's somehow, I think it's tied up in all that, not being able to make mistakes, not making space for people to actually fail and celebrate their failures, because that's part of what gets you to, the other side of that. Yeah.
So I'll just share a perspective that I'm thinking of is comes from the adult development world, and specifically Torbert's action inquiry models, where people who are going back to Jung's question about a colonial energy, at least, even if it's misunderstood, that's getting picked up, is that there's people who are earlier in their development cycles tend to be more exploitive, or it's one of the stages that he identifies, and its root is in their unmet needs or their unmet connection to who they are. So I have to be exploitive in order for me to feel powerful, in order for me to feel worthy, in order for me to have control of who I am. It's because I'm undeveloped emotionally and psychologically that I have to adopt these strategies. And so how do you, when you're encountering with that, I don't know that there's a way to resist this, because you just create more resistance, right? So to get behind that, one of the developmental markers for someone moving forward is to, what we might call empathy or compassion. And so it's just the capacity to pay attention to what's happening outside of themselves. might be a way to redirect someone like that. Just making not necessarily making the emotional plea or the moral plea, but simply helping them to understand the ramifications for others that are in their sphere, and they may or may not care. But that's, I think, where you have to go, and to reassure them. They're looking for reassurance. They're just looking for it in a bad way. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I connect with both of those points, and I think this way of winning or knowing everything as part of it is very much part and parcel of the hierarchical mindset. And parents' ownership of children, husbands' ownership of wives, those domestic sense of property is very integral to the whole hierarchical structure of society when it came about as well. Like the book, The Dawn of Everything, has been blowing my mind recently. And so there's a lot about all this there.
Okay, so we got to do trauma healing. We got to dismantle patriarchy. So far, we're coming up with a nice to-do list here. Wonder if we might want to invite folks. Well, I would like propose, if folks are open to it, that we just drop into breakouts here for a few minutes to form an intention. And the invitation here is, and Stephen and Tom, feel free to, all good on to you. Hope you had a lovely hike. Yeah, maybe we can, in the group that you're in, invite others to kind of frame the inquiry first. But basically the question here is, Monica closed by offering, what's a +1? What's one tiny thing you can do to shift a bit more toward curiosity, a bit more toward understanding, a bit more toward this kind of concept of, I never thought of it that way. So I personally have a hard time taking action if I don't have an intention. So I was going to take the opportunity myself to also do that. So yeah, if folks are open to it, I thought we could do maybe 7 or 8 minutes here in groups of 3 and just kind of chew on what might you want to take away from this conversation. It's just something you'd like to do. Our initial prompt for folks who weren't here was to imagine a person with whom you wish you could have the kind of conversation you long for, and frame what might that difficult conversation look like if you had the tools. Understand that you can't change them, but you could at least approach with a bit more groundedness, perhaps. Does that sound okay for folks? We'll do a little breakout and then we'll come back here to close. Not seeing any vigorous disagreement. That's a low bar for consent, but we'll take it. And if anyone wants to hang out, so we'll be back here in about 7 or so minutes.
This meeting is being recorded.
Whoa, welcome back, y'all. Did anybody solve it? Yeah, I guess we've got maybe 7 or 8 minutes here to close. Maybe we can invite, I'm sort of tempted to do a full round if we can sneak it in, but maybe just invite folks who feel like they want to share either your intention or something that came up in your group that you might want to bring back to us. It's an open floor.
I think my realization, just in terms of the intent, I at least hope I have, is how hard it is to feel curious when you think you're right.
Maybe I can name one inquiry, one intention. The inquiry that Tom and Steve and I were kicking around is, I have some beef with sort of developmental stages as a concept, but how do you share your learning from a different place in the developmental journey? So we were talking about race. So if you've sort of moved through a place of understanding whiteness and kind of deconstructing relationships and race, how do you then talk to someone who hasn't yet embarked on that journey without elevating yourself to this position of like holier than thou, or, oh, I used to be like you. And so I think there's a broader inquiry from around how do you connect across a difference in, it's not just knowledge, it's also like a process of having moved through something difficult. So if y'all have thoughts on that, I'm curious. And the intention for me is basically to pick up the thread that Yang and Chase and Aloysius were kicking around, which is, yeah, just calling time out in a conversation where I feel myself disconnecting from myself, either getting too in my head or, yeah, I feel like I'm no longer vulnerable and just kind of talking at someone, trying to call pause sooner, basically. Check.
Yeah, I'll follow that. I think one of the key takeaways is when Monica talked about to create trust rather than shared reality. I thought that was a really good pivot. And to my action thing, I think it's not only to call the pause, but basically to call the pause unilaterally. Right. And like also understanding, I think I have an additional inquiry, like how much safety is enough for me to unilaterally do that in a conversation, because there are conversations that's not sufficiently safe to do that. So that's where I am.
Maybe one or two other voices before we close. Have we solved it? Everyone's good. We're complete, ready to go, engage in difficult conversations. We'll invite folks to chime in if there's something else you want to bring. But yeah, apologies again for the false start here. I feel bad that we tried to build belonging and then kicked a bunch of people out because tech didn't serve us. So I'll try to get over that. But thanks for joining and sharing your thoughts. And yeah, I'm curious about. Yeah, I kind of want to take some of these conversations back and continue to poke a little bit, and appreciate the contributions here. So building belonging, these are kind of these little hybrid events where it's folks from the community and folks who have expressed interest in being part of the community to get to know each other and play in space together around some juicy questions. We've done a couple recently just around books because a couple of our members have written them, but we're also like super interested, well, myself, I'm super interested in creating more spaces like this where we can kind of interchange with what others are learning. For y'all's awareness, we've had this stewardship circle up and running for about a year now, sort of two different versions of stewardship is basically what we call leadership inside the communities. We're taking responsibility for shaping it. And that second process is coming to a close this month. So hopefully we'll have a lot more to share. I know it's been a little bit, well, my feeling has been, we've been a little bit quiet communicating with you about what's happening inside as we do some kind of internal tending. So we want to kind of pivot into more external engagement and think about ways to create space to to hear and share what we're learning and hear what you're learning and find places to exchange. So you can follow us. Kate, I will try to find the chat. Thank you. Medium and YouTube, we'll be having our next conversation. It's resuming the conversation on transformation that we did back in 2020. So it's a series of like inviting folks who are deep in practice around whatever issue to help dive into that issue with a live audience. So this next one is on liberatory governance, which is basically if we want a world without coercion, how do we organize ourselves? Do we have bosses? If we don't have bosses, what does that look like? How do we get things done? So I'll have a few folks who have been deep in that practice and invite y'all to help make a collective sense of it and see how it might apply to your work. Let me stop there, invite folks to, since there's a small enough group, I think we can come off mute and just share. I'll just stop the recording here. Share how you're feeling, how you're leaving today, and then we'll do a little goodbye.